Thank you for inviting me to address this important gathering. I know that the conversation here will focus on international development and that Norad is a major contributor to foreign aid and that Norway likes to consider itself a global leader in development assistance. I will speak to all of that shortly. But first, I want to remind us about why we are really here, or at least why we should be here. And that is to talk about people, real people, and especially people who are vulnerable, poor, and suffering. So before I'm able to talk about development aid, I need to tell you a story about people. Last September, I spent a few days with UNICEF in Turkana County, in the Horn of Africa, to meet with people who are suffering with the historic drought that is wreaking havoc on communities there. Turkana County and other parts of the Horn of Africa have suffered 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons. The drought is killing crops. There is no pasture for the livestock, and water sources are drying up everywhere. The ongoing emergency in the Horn of Africa is depriving children of clean, fresh water, of food or livelihoods, and access to life-saving health services. It is keeping them from the classroom and forcing their families to move. Over those days, I spent time with people who have done literally nothing to create the climate crisis, but who are suffering its worst impacts. I spent time with mothers who are desperately trying to keep their young ones alive, trying to find food and water to sustain their families' lives for another week, another day, even just another hour. I spend time with their children who are clinging to life. And all of this is happening at what scientists believe is 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming, the most ambitious threshold set out by the Paris Agreement is 1.5 degrees Celsius. Many scientists now believe that 1.5 degrees Celsius may be impossible and that keeping global warming below even 2 degrees Celsius is highly unlikely. How many points of a degree do we have to watch tick by before the world says enough? Where I live, millions of people are already on the verge of starvation. At the current rate of emissions, it is estimated that by 2050, there could be 1.2 billion climate refugees. Statistics like these are important because they offer us a sense of scale. But we must remember that we are not just talking about statistics. We are here to talk about people. I want to tell you about one of the people I had the chance to meet while I was in Turkana County with UNICEF. I met a young boy in hospital where the worst cases of severe acute malnutrition are referred and treated. It was devastating for me to see, especially when there are available solutions that can be put in place to stop children from suffering like this. Unfortunately, this child's family was not able to access the proper services in time for him to receive the treatment that he needed. And by the time the sun set that evening, sadly, he had passed away. This is one story about how the climate crisis is affecting people all around the world, especially in the global south. How many children need to needlessly die before the world says enough? As I said at the beginning, Norway likes to refer itself as a global leader in development assistance. I also understand that Norad provides around 1% of gross domestic income to foreign aid. I understand that Norad is still leading an initiative called Oil for Development. Let me be candid. Sending money to the global south in the form of finance for the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure is not aid at all. In fact, it is a travesty. And like any initiative that is funding any new fossil fuel infrastructure, it must end right now. Yes, it is true that energy poverty is still hurting millions of people in Africa and across the global south. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, around 600 million people still don't have basic access to electricity. But let's be very clear about this. Big oil and gas companies have been promising to lift people out of energy poverty for decades, and it's all been a lie. How many lies have to be told before the world says enough? Fossil fuel companies know all too well that the oil and gas pipelines will never reach those who live at the last mile. The oil and gas that fossil fuel companies relentlessly want to develop in Africa will not be for Africans. No, that oil and gas will be loaded onto ships and sent to Europe. The profits from that new fossil fuel development will line in the pockets of those who are already very rich. And when that new fossil fuel infrastructure has to become obsolete in the next couple of decades, the resulting debt will suffocate Africans who are already gasping under existing debt. How much debt needs to be added onto existing debt before the world says enough? And we know that the cheapest, fastest way to get energy to people living at the last mile is through distributed renewable energy. So please, let's put an end to this idea of oil for development. Norad needs to champion clean, renewable energy for development. It's energy that people need, not oil. Now on to the larger national context. Norway often likes to portray itself as a climate leader. But just last week, the Norwegian government announced that it plans to offer a record number of gas and oil exploration blocks in the Arctic. Norway, a so-called climate leader, is proposing 92 exploration blocks, including 78 in the Barents Sea in the far north. The other 14 blocks are in the Norwegian Sea near the Arctic Circle. Does this sound like climate leadership to you? How much hypocrisy needs to be exposed before the world says enough? The Norwegian government likes to claim that it should be able to expand oil production because its oil is cleaner than the oil from other countries. Let me be very clear here. There is no such thing as clean oil. Norway should end all new investments in fossil fuels and use the billions it has amassed from the current energy crisis to fast-track clean energy for those that need it the most. And you don't have to take my word for it. The UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, has repeatedly reminded leaders that any new investment in fossil fuels is moral and economic madness. Last week in Davos, at the World Economic Forum, Mr. Guterres stated that the business model of the oil and gas companies is not compatible with human survival. In Davos, I joined a group of youth climate activists who met with Mr. Fatih Birol, the executive director of the IEA. And last week, the IEA published a report which showed how we can have no new fossil fuel development if we are to have a chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Together with Dr. Birol, we called on the major oil and gas companies to stop all new finance for fossil fuels to give future generations a fighting chance to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis. How many experts need to explain this before the world says enough? I have only 10 seconds left, but this is an important message to deliver. So on behalf of all these experts, I am pleading for the Norwegian government to stop finance for all new fossil fuel development, to massively scale up finance for renewable energy, especially in the global south, and to make finance, climate finance, in the form of grants and not high-interest loans. All too often, Norway gives with one hand and takes with another. Yes, Norway invests in renewables, but it continues to develop oil and gas exports, which increases emissions, which increases climate impacts, which are continuing to wreak havoc on vulnerable communities, on people, real people like that boy in Turkana. It is time to stop the moral and economic madness. It is time to stop the hypocrisy and the lies. Norway, you cannot have it both ways. Enough is enough. Thank you.